Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The encounter at check-in. The hum of distant conversations and the shuffle of shoes on polished floors filled the terminal as Danielle Robinson walked through the airport gates. Clad in a sharp black blazer and fitted pants, her presence exuded the quiet confidence that came with knowing exactly where she was headed, and the magnitude of what was at stake. Her suitcase, a deep burgundy leather piece, rolled effortlessly beside her, as though in sync with her focused stride. Danielle's heart, though steady on the outside, beat with a rhythmic thrum of anticipation. She wasn't just traveling for any business meeting. This trip had been months in the making, months of planning, countless negotiations, and long nights spent analyzing figures and market trends. What awaited her at the other end of this flight was a deal that could not only take her career to new heights, but change the course of her family's legacy. It was the kind of opportunity she had worked tirelessly to secure, and everything she had done in her life led to this moment. Her thoughts circled around the impending negotiations as she moved towards the check-in counter. The airport was busy, as it always was at this hour, but Danielle's mind was locked in on her goal. She had already checked her itinerary and knew exactly what needed to be done. With a deep breath, she approached the line for priority check-in, confident that the process would be smooth. After all, she had a first-class ticket, privileges that came with the territory. The line at the priority counter was relatively short, just a few people ahead of her. As she moved forward, she noticed the calm air of experienced travelers around her, people who knew the drill. They exchanged casual pleasantries with the agents, whose smiles were as automatic as their efficient movements. This was the luxury of the first-class traveler, where the little details were attended to with grace and ease. Danielle approached the counter, ready to present her ticket, when a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am, could you step to the side for a moment?" The voice was cold and authoritative, but not rude. It belonged to a young man behind the counter, perhaps in his mid-20s, with a crisp uniform and a name tag that read Jordan. Danielle's brows furrowed. "I'm sorry, is there a problem?" she asked, her tone calm yet firm. "Just a moment, please." Jordan's eyes scanned her ticket and the boarding pass on his screen before turning to a colleague who was managing a different lane. His actions felt almost mechanical, like a deliberate delay. Danielle, never one to tolerate inefficiency, stood still, observing his every move. Jordan returned a minute later, a false smile plastered on his face. "I'm afraid you'll need to go to the regular check-in counter for your flight, ma'am." Danielle blinked, unsure of whether she had heard correctly. "I'm sorry, but I have a first-class ticket. This is the priority lane." The agent's demeanor shifted slightly, as though he had anticipated her response, but had already made up his mind. "Yes, I understand that. However, we're currently prioritizing other passengers, and there's a bit of a backlog here. I recommend you head to the other lane." He gestured dismissively to the regular check-in line, which was now considerably longer. A ripple of discomfort washed over Danielle, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "Is there a reason I can't check in here? My ticket specifically lists priority check-in." The agent paused for a beat, his eyes scanning her up and down. His expression hardened, and there was an unmistakable flicker of judgment in his gaze. "I'm afraid the priority line is reserved for more important customers." "I'm sure you'll understand," he said with a faint smirk, which made Danielle's chest tighten in disbelief. Danielle had heard it before, the subtle undercurrent of disrespect. She had faced challenges in her life where her competence and abilities were questioned based solely on her appearance. As a Black woman, she knew that she often had to navigate the world with an awareness that many others didn't. But this time, this moment, it felt different. It wasn't just the usual challenge of being underestimated, it was a blatant dismissal, one that she wasn't going to let slide. She took a step closer to the counter, her posture straightening. "I would like to speak to your manager, please." Jordan seemed momentarily thrown off by the request, but quickly regained his composure. "I'm afraid that's not necessary. I've already explained the situation." Danielle's patience was wearing thin, but she refused to let the situation escalate into a confrontation. Instead, she made a decision that was both bold and entirely in line with her character. "I'll wait for your manager, thank you," she said firmly, folding her arms across her chest and setting her gaze on the young agent. She wasn't going to be hurried or pushed aside. Jordan's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't argue further. After a long pause, he walked away, presumably to find his manager. Danielle stood there, her thoughts racing. What was this really about? The more she reflected, the more she realized that this wasn't just a matter of a mix-up at the check-in counter. It was a power play, a reminder of who was seen as worthy of respect and who wasn't. As she waited, she couldn't help but think about the countless times she had been underestimated. She had been told she was too ambitious or too assertive by those who were uncomfortable with her strength. There had been people who thought she wouldn't make it in her field, or that she didn't belong in spaces where success was measured by numbers and not appearances. But Danielle had proven them wrong time and time again. She had built her business from the ground up, worked through obstacles that would have made others falter, and remained resolute in the face of adversity. The manager finally arrived, a woman in her early 40s, with short-cropped hair and a no-nonsense attitude that matched her uniform. Danielle could see the familiar signs of someone used to dealing with customer service challenges. The manager looked at Danielle, then at Jordan, and asked, "What seems to be the problem here?" Danielle explained the situation calmly, detailing how she had been directed away from the priority check-in counter despite having a valid first-class ticket. The manager's expression was one of mild surprise, but when Jordan piped up to explain the situation from his perspective, Danielle noticed the slight nod he gave her manager, almost as if they were in agreement. The manager looked back at Danielle. "I see. Well, we don't usually like to escalate these things, but I'm sure we can get you sorted. Please head to the priority counter. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Danielle's heart sank, but she nodded and walked away. Though the issue had been addressed, it wasn't the resolution she had hoped for. She had been made to feel less than, to feel as though her presence was an inconvenience. It was a stinging reminder that, in certain circles, her value was still being questioned. But as she made her way to the counter, where she was promptly checked in and allowed to board, Danielle realized something important. She had been humiliated in a moment, but this was not the end. She wasn't going to let this experience define her. She was going to use it to fuel something even bigger than this small act of injustice. In that moment, Danielle Robinson made a decision. She wasn't just going to fight for respect on a personal level, she was going to change the game entirely. And that, as it turned out, was just the beginning of her journey. The plan unfolds. The engines of the jet roared to life as the plane taxied down the runway, carrying Danielle Robinson away from the turbulent encounter at the airport and into the vast expanse of the sky. The cabin was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning system and the occasional murmur of other passengers. Danielle, seated in the first-class section, sat with her back straight, gazing out the window as the city below gradually shrank into a patchwork of buildings and roads. Her thoughts, however, were miles away from the beauty of the clouds drifting beneath the wing. She was replaying the events at the airport over and over in her mind. The dismissive attitude of the check-in agent, the look of disdain from the gate attendants. She had expected challenges, but this felt like something more. It was more than an isolated incident of poor customer service. It was a subtle, but unmistakable message, one that wasn't about a mistake in procedure or a simple misunderstanding. This was a statement, one that questioned her place in the very spaces she had fought so hard to occupy. The weight of it lingered in her chest. Danielle had worked her entire career to prove herself, never given the luxury of being taken seriously just because of her education, her background, or her reputation. She had always known that she had to be twice as good, twice as strategic, and twice as patient as anyone else. But this was something different. The sting of being reduced to an afterthought in the most public of ways left her with an unsettling mixture of anger and determination. She glanced down at her phone, which buzzed softly with an incoming notification. It was a reminder from her assistant, reminding her about the deal that awaited her in New York, the meeting that had taken months to arrange, the one that would put her at the top of the corporate ladder. But even as the promise of success beckoned, Danielle couldn't help but feel as though the incident at the airport was more than just a small hiccup. It was a catalyst, a spark for something larger. For the first time in years, Danielle had a burning desire to not just succeed but to disrupt. What had happened at the airport was a microcosm of a much larger issue, one that affected not just her, but countless others who faced bias, prejudice, and systemic inequality in the corporate world and beyond. She wasn't just frustrated with being treated poorly at the airport, she was upset by the entire system that allowed it to happen. Danielle had always fought for progress, but now, in this moment, she wanted to create it. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, Danielle had made up her mind. She had always been a woman of action, and this time would be no different. She needed to think bigger. Much bigger. This wasn't just about the airline, or the inconvenience she had faced, it was about something that could shift the entire power dynamic, something that could hold companies accountable for the ways they treated people, especially people like her. The hours passed as the plane glided through the sky, and Danielle allowed herself the luxury of a few moments of quiet. She'd need all of her energy and focus for what came next. She needed to get ahead of the curve, to create a plan that was not only strategic but powerful. The truth was, she didn't just want to be successful in her career anymore. She wanted to own her destiny in a way that was so undeniable, so formidable, that no one would ever look down on her again. As she sipped the glass of champagne handed to her by the flight attendant, a new idea began to take shape. What if she could use her position, her influence, her wealth, not just to win in business, but to change the system itself? What if she could take the very institution that had slighted her, that had made her feel invisible, and use it to make a statement that would echo across industries? Her gaze turned toward the skyline visible below. The answer was clear. Back in the heart of the city, Danielle spent the next several days meeting with investors, legal advisors, and trusted mentors. She called in favors, worked her network, and began formulating her plan in earnest. It was time to act, and Danielle didn't do anything halfway. The idea had sprouted in her mind, but now she had to nurture it into something solid, something that could not only disrupt the industry but also send a clear message about the power of resilience and the importance of standing up for oneself. Her first move was to look into the airline's financials. She wasn't just going to make a complaint or cause a stir in the press, she was going to make an impact that would leave the company reeling. Danielle had always known how to play the long game, and this time, she wasn't going to let emotion dictate her actions. She was going to take the calculated steps needed to not just disrupt, but to acquire. Her legal team, top-tier professionals who had helped her navigate many previous business ventures, worked tirelessly on the logistics. They pored over the airline's financial statements, analyzed their stock performance, and scrutinized their corporate structure. What Danielle discovered was both surprising and empowering. The airline, which appeared so untouchable in the moment of her humiliation, was struggling. Publicly, it was a giant, but behind the scenes, it was facing internal turmoil, leadership challenges, and rising costs that threatened its future. Danielle's legal team quickly moved to acquire a significant share in the company, utilizing her substantial wealth and influence to push for a position on the board. She used her network of investors, those who had been with her since the early days of her business, to buy shares in the company at a significant discount. Within weeks, Danielle was the largest single shareholder of the airline, holding enough stock to sway major decisions at the corporate level. But Danielle wasn't just in it for the financial win. She had a message to deliver, one that she planned to broadcast loud and clear. She wasn't going to sit at the table of a company that had treated her like an afterthought, she was going to take over it. Her first meeting with the airline's executive team was set for the following week. Danielle had already made her intentions known, she wasn't interested in running the company for its own sake. She wasn't interested in building an empire of luxury jets or expanding the network to more destinations. What she wanted was something far more powerful. She wanted accountability. She wanted to change the way this company, and others like it, treated their customers, especially those who had been made to feel insignificant. The morning of the meeting arrived, and Danielle felt an electric charge of anticipation in her chest. This was it. This was the moment that would define everything. She walked into the boardroom, a confident smile on her lips, her eyes sharp with purpose. "I'm here today," Danielle began, her voice steady and commanding, "not just as an investor, but as someone who will no longer tolerate the kind of treatment I experienced from this company. I'm not here to ask for apologies. I'm here to demand change." The room fell silent. "I've spent my entire career building something from the ground up. I know what it takes to lead. But more importantly, I know what it feels like to be overlooked, underestimated, and disrespected. No one in this room, or anywhere else, will ever treat me or anyone else that way again." Her words hung in the air like a declaration of war. The executives at the table exchanged uneasy glances, but Danielle's gaze never wavered. She was in control now. And with that, the real work began. The power shift. The boardroom was stark, with sleek glass windows framing the sprawling city below. The polished wood table reflected the ambient light from the chandeliers above, casting soft shadows over the faces of the men and women seated across from Danielle. She had done her research, prepared herself meticulously, and now she was standing in the very place where decisions had been made about her, about people like her, decisions that had dismissed her worth, her value. Today, she was going to change that. Danielle sat at the head of the table, her posture as sharp as her gaze. Her mind was clear, laser-focused. She knew what she had to do. This wasn't about power for power's sake, it wasn't even about revenge. It was about justice. It was about creating a space where people, no matter their background, race, or gender, could thrive without being overlooked or underestimated. The time for playing by the rules of an antiquated system was over. She wasn't interested in just sitting at the table anymore. She was here to take over the narrative. The executives shifted in their seats as Danielle's piercing gaze swept across them. The room was tense, and there was an unspoken understanding that this meeting was going to be different. One of the senior members cleared his throat, attempting to break the silence. "Ms. Robinson," he began, his voice shaky but attempting to maintain authority. "We understand that you've recently acquired a significant stake in the company, and we're grateful for the opportunity to work with you. However, it's important to remember that the airline has been a leader in the industry for over 50 years. We have a well-established structure in place, and we've weathered many storms before. We would appreciate your input, but I'm sure you can understand that major changes take time." Danielle let the words hang in the air, her eyes fixed on the speaker, an older man with thinning hair and a wrinkled face. He was the type of corporate executive who carried the aura of untouchability, the kind who sat comfortably in his position because he had always been surrounded by the same kind of people, people who looked like him, felt like him, and reinforced the systems that kept him at the top. Danielle knew that he, like many in the room, thought of the company as an unshakable institution, one that had existed long before her and would continue to exist long after. But what he didn't realize was that everything was changing now. "I'm not here for the usual corporate pleasantries," Danielle said, her voice calm but with a quiet intensity that commanded attention. "I'm here because I believe in the future of this company, but only if it is built on a foundation of fairness and accountability. What happened to me at the airport wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a reflection of everything wrong with your organization, and everything wrong with the industry at large. This company treats people like me as if we don't belong. You've built a system that's exclusive, and that needs to change." A murmur of discomfort rippled through the room. A few of the executives shifted uncomfortably, their eyes avoiding hers. Danielle could see it, their unease, their discomfort with her words. They weren't used to being confronted with the realities of their power, their privilege, and the consequences of their actions. They had lived in a bubble of privilege, insulated from the world outside by the walls of their corporate headquarters. "You see," Danielle continued, leaning forward slightly, her fingers lightly tapping the surface of the table, "I've spent my entire life being told I don't belong. I've had to fight for every opportunity, prove myself again and again, just to be seen as competent. But that's not what this is about. I'm not here for a seat at the table. I'm here to change the table. I'm here to build something that doesn't just work for people like you, but for everyone, no matter where they come from. Her words hit like a lightning strike, and for the first time in years, she could see that her audience was actually listening. Danielle wasn't just a disruptor, she was a visionary, someone who wasn't afraid to take a bold stand. The executives, for the first time, were forced to confront the systemic issues that had allowed them to rise to the top while ignoring the realities of those they had left behind. One of the younger executives, a woman in her early 30s with short, dark hair and sharp features, spoke up. "I agree with you, Danielle," she said, her voice measured but thoughtful. "There's no denying that we've fallen short when it comes to diversity and inclusion. But the reality is, changing a company like this is a massive undertaking. It will take time, and we will need to rebuild trust with both our customers and our employees." Danielle nodded, recognizing the sincerity in the woman's tone. This was someone who understood that change wasn't just about optics, it was about a fundamental shift in how the organization operated, how it treated people, and how it interacted with the world. But time, Danielle knew, was something they didn't have. The industry was changing rapidly, and those who were unwilling to evolve would be left behind. "You're right," Danielle said, her voice unwavering. "It will take time. But we don't have the luxury of waiting anymore. The people I'm speaking for, the ones who have been overlooked, disregarded, and told they don't belong, they can't wait. I don't care about the history of this company. I care about what we can do moving forward. And moving forward means completely overhauling how you do business. It means investing in people, in communities that have been left out of your plans for too long." The room was quiet for a long moment. Danielle could feel the weight of the conversation settling in, and she knew that she had their attention. The older executives were beginning to grasp what she was saying, but it was the younger members of the team who seemed to be nodding in agreement. They had grown up in a world where diversity, equity, and inclusion were not just buzzwords, they were imperatives. Danielle's next words cut through the tension with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "I want to take control of this company," she said flatly, her gaze sweeping the room once more. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you. I am now your largest shareholder, and I have the power to make decisions. I will no longer tolerate business as usual. If I am going to be involved, then we will be transparent. We will prioritize the needs of the many, not the few. And I'll tell you right now, if anyone on this team is uncomfortable with that vision, then they are free to walk away. But if you stay, you will be held accountable. This company will be rebuilt from the ground up, and the people who have been marginalized will be given a seat at the table. If you can't accept that, then we will part ways." For a few moments, no one spoke. The tension in the room was palpable. The executives exchanged looks, unsure of how to respond to the force of Danielle's presence. Finally, the older man who had spoken earlier, the one with the wrinkled face, cleared his throat and looked at her with a mixture of surprise and begrudging respect. "I see you have thought this through," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "But you must understand, this is a huge shift. It's going to take more than just a few boardroom changes. It's going to take a complete rethinking of our business model, our brand, and our entire corporate structure. We need a clear plan, and it needs to be executed without alienating our current customer base." Danielle met his gaze squarely. "Then let's get to work. I'm not here for half measures. I'm here to lead, to make sure that the changes we implement are not just cosmetic, but foundational. We are going to reshape this company so that it truly reflects the world we live in. And trust me, if we get this right, not only will we rebuild trust with the people we've lost, we'll become a leader in the industry for doing it right." The room fell silent again, but this time, it was a silence of contemplation, not resistance. Danielle could see the wheels turning in the minds of the executives. They were realizing, slowly but surely, that the world they had once operated in was no longer the world of tomorrow. If they didn't adapt, if they didn't listen, they would be left behind. She had no illusions about how difficult the road ahead would be, but one thing was clear: Danielle Robinson wasn't just here to be a part of the system. She was here to rewrite the rules. And the first rule she was going to rewrite was one that had been broken by the very company she had now set her sights on. Respect. The kind of respect that transcended tokenism, that didn't just look good on paper, but was embedded in the very foundation of the company's culture. It was time for a revolution. And Danielle was its leader. The revolution begins. The first few weeks following that pivotal boardroom meeting felt like a blur to Danielle. The world she had known was shifting under her feet, and the changes she had promised to initiate were now in motion. She could feel the weight of her decisions, of taking control of an entire corporation, not as a burden, but as an exhilarating responsibility. This wasn't just about business for her anymore. This was about creating an ecosystem that could withstand the storm of corporate prejudice, that could prove to the world that inclusion and equity weren't just buzzwords. They were the future. Danielle's first priority was the boardroom itself. She knew that the people around the table had to be committed to her vision if any change was going to stick. The people who had clung to outdated systems and been part of the old guard would have to leave. They would have to go. It was painful for her to consider, but necessary. The truth was, many of the executives she had inherited were complacent, comfortable in their positions of privilege. To her, their continued presence in the company would be a roadblock, an anchor that could prevent her from achieving true transformation. So, over the next few days, she began to make her moves. She had already reshaped the company's values and goals, equality, diversity, and transparency at the forefront. Her legal team had been working around the clock, drafting new bylaws and restructuring proposals. But there was a deeper task ahead, dismantling the old guard's influence without losing sight of the company's profitability. Danielle started by quietly working on her relationship with the mid-level management, those who had been caught between the entrenched corporate hierarchy and the newer, more progressive ideals that she championed. She understood that leadership came not just from the top, but from every corner of the company. In the weeks following her takeover, Danielle held a series of open forums with employees from all departments, listening to their concerns, frustrations, and hopes. She wanted to make it clear that her intentions were not just about shaking up the leadership at the top, but also about creating a ripple effect throughout the company. Every employee's voice mattered, and she wanted them to know that they were being heard. In these forums, Danielle heard stories that reinforced her decision to take control. Stories from people who had worked at the company for years, if not decades, only to be passed over for promotions or opportunities because of the color of their skin, their gender, or their socioeconomic status. The deeper she dug, the more she realized how ingrained the culture of exclusion and favoritism had been. It wasn't just the executives who needed a wake-up call, it was the entire corporate ecosystem. Danielle's heart burned with a sense of urgency. If she truly wanted to change the trajectory of the company and the industry, she would have to be relentless. The first move was the leadership shakeup. Danielle had made it clear from the outset that change was not optional. In the weeks following her announcement, many of the older, more conservative members of the board had started to quietly leave. Some had been given golden parachutes, while others had been offered roles in smaller subsidiaries or branches of the company, far from the decision-making table. But it wasn't just about removing people, it was about bringing in the right people to replace them. Danielle reached out to leaders who had proven themselves in the field of diversity and inclusion, professionals who understood the nuances of systemic change and had made their careers out of creating corporate cultures that valued all people. She wanted individuals who would not just speak about equality but actively fight for it, people who would challenge her when necessary and help guide the company toward a future where fairness wasn't just an aspiration but a practice. One of the first hires was a woman named Lisa Grant, a trailblazer in diversity strategy who had turned multiple tech firms around by transforming their corporate culture. Lisa had spent over 20 years working in corporate America, a fierce advocate for women of color and underrepresented minorities. She had long been a mentor to young professionals seeking to navigate the complexities of corporate life, and she was exactly the type of person Danielle needed on her team. Lisa quickly became Danielle's right-hand woman, handling everything from internal audits to ensuring that the company's recruitment process was revamped to include diverse talent at every level. Together, they formed a team of consultants and experts who would not just reform the company, they would revolutionize it. Danielle made it clear to everyone involved, this was no longer a typical corporate overhaul. This was a mission, and every person on her team had a vital role to play. Lisa's first big project was the creation of an entirely new hiring and promotions framework. No longer would positions be filled based on resumes alone. The process would now be holistic, focusing on not just skills but also lived experiences, the stories that people brought to the table, and their potential for growth within the company. Lisa introduced mentorship programs for employees who had traditionally been overlooked, providing them with guidance and support to help them rise through the ranks. But beyond the hiring practices, Lisa pushed for a broader, more radical change. She wanted to see the leadership team itself reflect the company's new direction. That meant a commitment to elevating women, people of color, and those from underrepresented groups into high-level decision-making positions. Danielle approved of every single one of Lisa's initiatives, her confidence in her new partner unwavering. Outside of the internal restructuring, Danielle turned her attention to the public perception of the airline. She knew that this would be a battle, not just with other corporations, but with the public. The media would be watching closely, waiting for any slip-up, any indication that Danielle's mission to transform the airline was just another corporate gimmick. They'd seen it before, companies publicly pledging diversity and inclusion only to quietly return to their old ways once the cameras were gone. Danielle couldn't afford to let that happen. She knew that to maintain credibility, she needed to go beyond simple words. She needed to show, through her actions, that the airline wasn't just talking the talk, but walking the walk. She began by releasing a statement outlining the company's new values, detailing the steps they were taking to reform both internally and externally. She announced that the airline would be offering scholarships and training programs for individuals from disadvantaged communities who were interested in careers in aviation, hospitality, and business. She also committed to diversifying the company's leadership team and publicly outlined their goals for hiring, promotions, and community outreach. And then, Danielle made a bold move. She invited the media to witness the entire process. She opened up the corporate doors to a group of journalists and activists, encouraging them to watch as the airline undertook its monumental transformation. She didn't shy away from scrutiny. She welcomed it. She made it clear that she was accountable, not just to shareholders, but to the people who had been overlooked for far too long. The press coverage was overwhelming. Initially, many outlets were skeptical. Was this just another corporate stunt, or was Danielle serious? But as the weeks turned into months, and the changes began to show visible results, the narrative shifted. People started to see Danielle Robinson not just as a business mogul, but as a champion of change. The airline, once known for its exclusivity and elitism, began to be recognized as a leader in corporate reform. Danielle's commitment to diversity didn't stop with her employees. She extended it to the customers as well. The airline began hosting events in major cities, partnering with local businesses owned by women and people of color. They sponsored arts programs, job fairs, and educational outreach initiatives in underrepresented communities. The company wasn't just flying people from one place to another anymore, it was connecting people to opportunities, to hope, to futures that had been closed off before. The resistance, however, was still palpable. Danielle knew there would always be those who resisted change. There were still factions of old-school corporate leaders and shareholders who questioned her methods, who thought her approach was too radical, too risky. They warned her against overpromising and underdelivering. But Danielle wasn't one to cower in the face of resistance. She knew that her mission was bigger than their doubts. She knew that the transformation she was leading was about more than just profits, it was about leaving a legacy of justice. As long as she was in control, she would never back down. And so, with each passing day, Danielle continued to rewrite the rules. She knew that true change took time, but she was willing to do the work, push through the barriers, and face the challenges head-on. She had started a revolution, not just in the airline industry, but in the very way corporate America thought about power, leadership, and respect. And Danielle Robinson was just getting started. The legacy of change. It was a crisp morning in early spring when Danielle Robinson stood at the front of a crowded boardroom, facing a team of executives, investors, and media representatives. The air was thick with anticipation, the eyes of the room fixed on her as she prepared to make her most important announcement yet. The airline, now a transformed entity, had completed its first year under her leadership. It had been a year of monumental shifts, some small and incremental, others so revolutionary that they had completely redefined the company. And as she stood there, reflecting on the journey so far, Danielle felt a deep sense of pride mixed with determination. This was only the beginning. The airline was no longer just a transportation service. It had become a model for what the future of business could look like, an organization built on values of equity, inclusivity, and social responsibility. The changes Danielle had set in motion were rippling through every department, every policy, and every corner of the company. What had once been an exclusive, old-fashioned corporate culture had evolved into a thriving, diverse, and forward-thinking organization. As Danielle looked out over the room, she couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come in just 12 months. The old regime had been completely replaced. The board of directors now included individuals who represented the communities the airline once ignored. Women, people of color, LGBTQ+ leaders, and people from varied socioeconomic backgrounds now sat at the decision-making table, bringing fresh perspectives and experiences to a company that had previously been out of touch with the realities of its customers. And the results spoke for themselves. Employee retention had skyrocketed. The company's customer satisfaction ratings were at an all-time high, with people from diverse backgrounds praising the airline's commitment to creating a welcoming and inclusive environment. The airline's commitment to sustainability and social good had made headlines, with Danielle herself becoming a spokesperson for corporate responsibility. In the year following her takeover, the airline had increased its profitability by nearly 25%, surpassing expectations and setting a new standard in the industry. Danielle had always known that financial success and social impact could coexist. Her belief in the intersection of business and social justice had been proven time and time again over the past year. But there was one more step in her journey, a final piece of the puzzle that would solidify her legacy and ensure that the changes she had fought for would endure long after she was gone. The launch of the Legacy Fund. Danielle's decision to launch the Legacy Fund was nothing short of groundbreaking. She had long believed that the success of a company should be measured not only by its profits, but by its contributions to society. The Legacy Fund was her way of ensuring that the airline's success would be reinvested in the communities that had supported it for so long. It was a multi-billion-dollar initiative aimed at supporting underrepresented groups, from funding education and training programs to investing in small businesses and local infrastructure. The first project under the Legacy Fund was a comprehensive scholarship program for young people of color, specifically targeting those from low-income backgrounds who had previously been shut out of opportunities in the aviation and business sectors. The airline would offer full scholarships to students pursuing careers in aviation, hospitality, business management, and engineering, providing them with mentorship and internships to help them launch their careers. In addition to the scholarship program, the Legacy Fund would also be used to support grassroots initiatives in the cities where the airline operated. Danielle wanted to ensure that the communities that had supported the airline, often the same communities that had been underserved or overlooked by other corporations, could benefit from the company's success. The Legacy Fund would focus on job creation, environmental sustainability, and cultural preservation, with a particular emphasis on empowering women and people of color. The announcement of the fund was met with an outpouring of support from activists, educators, and community leaders who saw this as a true example of corporate responsibility. It wasn't just about checking boxes or making donations, it was about real, tangible change that would have a lasting impact. Danielle's commitment to reinvesting the company's success into the community became a central part of the airline's brand identity. The airline wasn't just a business, it was a force for good, a company that was actively working to dismantle systemic inequality and make a positive difference in the world. The ripple effect. While the airline's transformation was certainly Danielle's greatest achievement, the impact of her actions extended far beyond the company itself. The changes she had implemented within the organization began to inspire a ripple effect throughout the corporate world. Other companies, seeing the success of Danielle's model, began to take note. Some had already begun experimenting with diversity and inclusion programs, but Danielle's approach was different. She had shown that it was possible to merge profitability with social responsibility without sacrificing one for the other. Soon, Danielle found herself in high-demand speaking engagements, invited to conferences and summits where she shared her story and her vision for the future of corporate America. She was asked to advise governments, organizations, and corporations on how to build more inclusive business practices. And as her reputation grew, so did the movement she had started. The principles of fairness, transparency, and inclusion began to permeate the corporate landscape, influencing everything from hiring practices to product development. Danielle had always believed that real change began from the top down, but it also needed to be embraced from the bottom up. She saw the transformation in her own company, and now she was beginning to see it in the industry at large. Corporations that had long been dominated by homogeneous leadership teams were slowly beginning to diversify. They were bringing in more women, more people of color, and more voices from marginalized communities. It was a shift that was still in its infancy, but Danielle knew that the future was bright. The tide was turning. A personal legacy. As much as Danielle had worked tirelessly to transform the airline, her personal journey had also been one of incredible growth. She had always been driven by a desire to prove herself, to show the world that a Black woman could not only survive in corporate America but excel. But the more she worked on her business and the more she interacted with the communities she aimed to serve, the more Danielle realized that her true legacy wasn't just about her success or the success of the airline. It was about the doors she was opening for others, the paths she was carving for people who had never had the chance to walk them. Danielle knew that her greatest achievement would not be the billions in revenue the airline generated or even the high-profile awards she would inevitably receive. It was the opportunity she had created for others, the space she had made for people who had long been overlooked to find their voices, their purpose, and their place in the world. One evening, as she stood on the balcony of her office, looking out over the city, Danielle reflected on everything she had accomplished. She thought about the young people who would now have the chance to succeed because of the Legacy Fund, about the employees who had found new purpose in their work because of the company's commitment to fairness. She thought about the communities that had been uplifted by the airline's outreach and the partners who were now working alongside her to build a more inclusive world. In many ways, this was the moment Danielle had always dreamed of. This was the legacy she had fought for, not just for herself but for future generations. She had turned her pain into power, her frustration into a catalyst for change. And now, as she looked back at how far she had come, she knew that her story was one of resilience, of breaking barriers, and of creating a world where everyone had the opportunity to thrive. But even as she stood there, knowing she had achieved so much, Danielle was already thinking about the next challenge. There was still so much work to be done, so many more industries to transform, so many more systems to dismantle. She was just getting started. For Danielle Robinson, the story of overcoming disrespect at the airport wasn't just a moment of triumph, it was the first step in a journey that would change the world. And she knew that the best was yet to come.